If someone had told me that my life would change with just a glance at a text message, I wouldn't have believed them. But that's exactly how it started, small, like a hairline crack in glass. You don't see it at first, but over time, it spreads, until suddenly everything shatters. I'm Michael Adams, 34 years old, living in Chicago, and until a few months ago, I thought I had a pretty decent life. I had a stable job in marketing, working for a fast-growing firm under my boss, Richard Hayes, a charismatic, smooth-talking executive who everyone either admired or feared, or both. I was married to Emily, my college sweetheart. We'd been together for almost 10 years, married for 5. She was smart, beautiful, with a quick wit that had me hooked from the moment we met in a dusty lecture hall at Northwestern. Our marriage had its ups and downs like any other, but nothing that felt insurmountable. Or so I thought. Looking back, the signs were there, small shifts that didn't register as warnings at the time. Emily started staying out later, claiming she was working late or meeting friends I'd never met. She'd become more protective of her phone, turning the screen away when I'd walk by. Our conversations grew shorter, more transactional. She laughed less. We touched less, but I chalked it up to stress. We'd both been busy. Life was hectic. People drift sometimes, right? That's what I told myself. I didn't want to believe anything was wrong. It was easier that way until one day. It wasn't that it was a Thursday, one of those days that felt like it dragged on forever at work. I remember getting home late, exhausted from back-to-back meetings. Emily wasn't home yet, which wasn't unusual these days. She'd texted earlier, saying she had a work dinner with some colleagues. I didn't think much of it. That I tossed my keys on the counter, loosened my tie, and collapsed onto the couch. That's when I noticed her tablet on the coffee table, unlocked. Emily was always protective of her devices, usually quick to grab them if I got too close. But there it was, just sitting there, screen glowing softly in the dim light. That I wish I could say I hesitated, that I debated respecting her privacy. But the truth is, I picked it up without thinking, driven by a gut feeling I couldn't ignore. The first thing I saw was a string of messages, not from a friend, not from a colleague, but from Richard Hayes. My boss. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the thread. The texts were casual at first, work-related, even friendly. But then they shifted. Flirty comments. Inside jokes I wasn't part of. And then, unmistakable lines that hit me like a punch to the chest. Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you. When can I see you again? I miss you already. And Emily's replies, just as intimate. I miss you too. It's hard acting like nothing's happening when Michael's around. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. It felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. A mix of disbelief, rage, and heartbreak surged all at once. This wasn't just some stranger. This was my boss. The man I'd sat across from in countless meetings, the guy who'd given me advice about my career, the person I'd trusted professionally. And Emily? She'd been living a double life right under my nose. That I didn't know how long I sat there, rereading the messages, hoping I'd somehow misinterpreted them. But there was no mistaking the truth. It was right there in front of me, in black and white. When Emily finally walked through the door later that evening, laughing softly into her phone, I was still sitting on the couch, her tablet in my hands. She froze when she saw me, her smile fading instantly. That I met her eyes, holding up the tablet. Who's Richard, Emily? Her face went pale, and that's when everything started to unravel. Emily's face went from pale to a strange mix of shock and irritation, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. She slowly slipped her phone into her purse, her fingers lingering as if debating whether to pull it back out and erase the evidence I'd already seen. Michael, she started, forcing a small, nervous laugh. Why are you going through my stuff? Seriously? That was her first response, not an explanation, not denial, just flipping the situation back on me. I didn't even answer her question. I stood up, holding the tablet like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom. You've been sleeping with Richard, I said flatly. My voice was calm, too calm for what I felt inside. The rage was there, but buried under shock. I think I was still hoping for some kind of misunderstanding, for her to tell me I'd gotten it wrong. But the look in her eyes crushed that hope instantly. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, searching for words. "It's not what you think," she finally said. That I laughed, the sound sharp and hollow. "Oh really? Because it looks like my wife is having an affair with my boss. Seems pretty clear to me." Emily ran her hands through her hair, pacing a little, avoiding my eyes. "It just happened," she muttered. That phrase hit harder than I expected. It just happened. Like she'd tripped and fallen into his bed by accident. "For how long?" I asked, my voice low now, simmering. She hesitated. "Too long, 6 months, she admitted quietly. 6 months that I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. 6 months of lies, excuses, late nights at work, and fake smiles across the dinner table. 6 months of looking me in the eye and pretending everything was fine. Why him?" I managed to ask, my throat dry. She shrugged, still not meeting my gaze. "I don't know. It just felt exciting. He's confident, successful. I didn't plan for it." I stared at her, trying to understand how the woman I thought I knew could say that so casually, like she was describing an impulse buy at the store. "So what am I?" I asked bitterly. "The guy you come home to when you're done having your fun?" She didn't answer. That was worse than any excuse she could have given me. That I set the tablet down, the screen still glowing with the last message thread. "I need some air," I muttered, grabbing my jacket. "Michael, wait," but I was already out the door. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it didn't help. I walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, replaying the conversation over and over in my head, the words burning like acid. It just happened. It was exciting. By the time I got back, hours had passed. Emily was still awake, sitting on the couch, her face a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. "I'm sorry," she whispered when I walked in. I didn't respond. I just went straight to the bedroom, packed a bag, and left, because I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay, not in that house, not with her. The door closed behind me with a quiet click, but the noise echoed in my chest like a gunshot. I stood there for a moment, my bag hanging from my shoulder, staring at nothing, trying to process the last few hours. It felt surreal, like my life had shifted in an instant, like everything that had seemed solid was now slipping through my fingers. That I didn't have a plan. I just drove. The city lights blurred past the windshield, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. My phone buzzed several times. Emily, no doubt, but I didn't answer. What could she possibly say? "I'm sorry. It was a mistake." I'd already heard enough. I ended up at Ethan's place, my best friend since high school. He answered the door half asleep, wearing an old hoodie, confusion written all over his face. "Dude, what?" She cheated, I blurted out, my voice flat, numb. Saying the words out loud made it feel real, like I was finally giving it shape. "Wait," Ethan blinked, processing, then stepped aside without another word. That's what good friends do, they don't ask for details right away. They just let you in. I crashed on his couch, staring at the ceiling while he sat quietly nearby, giving me space. Eventually, the words started tumbling out, everything. The texts, the confrontation, the fact that it wasn't just some random guy, it was Richard, my boss. Ethan shook his head slowly. "Man, that's brutal." Brutal didn't even cover it. Over the next few days, I drifted in and out of reality, functioning on autopilot. I called in sick to work because, honestly, I couldn't face Richard, not yet. The thought of sitting in a meeting, pretending everything was fine while knowing he'd been with my wife made my skin crawl. Emily texted me every day. Apologies. Explanations. Promises that it didn't mean anything. But if it didn't mean anything, why did she risk everything for it? I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I didn't have the energy to engage. I needed space to think, to breathe. One evening, after a few too many beers with Ethan, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Smiling faces. Anniversary dinners. Vacations. Were those moments real? Or was it all just a lie wrapped in good lighting? The next morning, I woke up with a headache, not from the alcohol, but from the weight of it all. That's when I decided I needed to go back, not to talk. Not to forgive, but to face it head on. To face her, because the only way out was through. Walking up to the house felt like approaching a crime scene, familiar yet contaminated, tainted by the memories that now carried new meaning. The porch light was still on, casting long shadows across the driveway. I hesitated for a second, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Why am I even here? I asked myself. Closure? Answers? Maybe I just needed to see her face again, to confirm that the woman I married wasn't the same person on the other side of that door. I took a deep breath and walked in. Emily was sitting on the couch, her knees tucked under her, wrapped in one of those oversized sweaters she always wore when she was anxious. The TV was on, but she wasn't watching it. The moment she saw me, she jumped up, her face a mess of relief and worry. "Michael," she whispered, like my name was fragile, like saying it too loud might break me. I didn't respond. I just stood there, my eyes scanning the room. Everything was the same, our wedding photo on the shelf, the blanket we used to fight over, the candle she always lit in the evenings. But it all felt foreign, like someone else's life. She took a cautious step toward me. "I'm glad you came back. I've been going crazy." "Stop," I cut her off, my voice sharp but controlled. "I wasn't here for small talk." She froze, biting her lip like she was trying to hold back a flood of words. I set my bag down, not because I planned to stay, but because the weight of it was nothing compared to what I was carrying inside. "I need to know," I said quietly, my eyes locking onto hers. "How did it start?" She looked down, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. "It wasn't planned. It just happened. It just happened." The same excuse. As if an affair was like tripping over a crack in the sidewalk. I felt my jaw tighten. That's not good enough. You don't just accidentally sleep with someone. Especially not my boss. She sat back down, burying her face in her hands. "It started after that work party last year, the one you couldn't make because of your presentation. We were drinking, talking. I don't know. It felt easy." Easy, that word stung more than I expected. So what was I? The hard part of her life? She looked up, her eyes glassy. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. But then it kept happening. I didn't know how to stop. I stared at her, the woman I had shared a life with, realizing I didn't recognize her at all. The Emily I married wouldn't have done this. But here she was, unraveling the truth like it was an old sweater, each thread pulling apart what was left of us. "Why him?" I asked, my voice quieter now, not out of softness but exhaustion. She sighed. "Because he made me feel important. Like I mattered. I didn't feel that with us anymore." I took a step back, as if her words physically pushed me. "I didn't feel that with us anymore." I wanted to scream, to yell that I'd been there the whole time, trying, working, believing in us. But what was the point? It wouldn't change anything. After a long silence, I spoke. "I loved you, Emily. I thought we were a team. But you threw it all away for someone who doesn't even respect me, or you, for that matter." She started to cry, but I didn't feel sorry for her. "Not anymore. I don't know if I can fix this," I admitted. "I don't even know if I want to." She reached for me, but I stepped back. "Don't," I whispered. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. "Michael, please," she cried, her voice breaking. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, then turned slightly. "You made your choice, Emily. This is mine." And I walked out. Again, but this time, I wasn't coming back. Leaving that house for the second, and final, time felt different. The first time I left in a fog, lost in the shock of betrayal. This time, it was deliberate. Every step I took away from that door felt like shedding a layer of something heavy I'd been carrying for far too long. I didn't look back. Not because it was easy, but because I knew there was nothing left to see. I drove aimlessly for a while, letting the city lights blur past, the weight of the conversation replaying in my mind like a broken record. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. I didn't feel important with us anymore. Those words echoed louder than her apologies, each one a reminder that the person I thought I knew had been gone long before I discovered the truth. Eventually, I ended up at Ethan's place again. He opened the door without a word, just stepping aside to let me in. That's the thing about real friends, they don't push you to talk before you're ready. I sat down on his worn-out couch, staring at the floor. "It's over," I finally said, my voice flat. Ethan nodded, grabbed 2 beers from the fridge, and handed me one. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that felt comfortable because it didn't need to be filled with forced words. After a few sips, he asked, "So, what now?" I didn't have an answer. I'd been so consumed with what happened that I hadn't thought about what's next. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and uncomfortable conversations. I told my family. Their reactions were a mix of shock and sympathy. My mom cried, not because of Emily, but because she hated seeing me hurt. My dad just gave me a firm nod, his version of emotional support. At work, things were even more complicated. Facing Richard was inevitable. The first time I saw him after everything, we were in a meeting with several colleagues. He acted like nothing had happened, like he hadn't blown up my life outside of office hours. I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I kept it professional, even though my fists clenched under the table. Later that day, he cornered me in the hallway. "Michael, can we talk?" he asked, his tone low, as if we were discussing a missed deadline instead of the fact that he'd slept with my wife. I stared at him for a moment, then said, "There's nothing to talk about, Richard. You made your choices. So did I." Then I walked away, leaving him standing there, his fake charm crumbling. Emily tried reaching out a few more times, calls, texts, even an email. She wanted to meet, to explain more, as if there was some hidden detail that would suddenly make it all okay. I never responded. There was nothing left to say, but the silence didn't mean it was easy. The nights were the hardest. That's when the memories crept in, the good ones, the ones that made me question if it had all been a lie. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with the person who betrayed me. It felt like mourning someone who was still alive. One night, after another restless attempt at sleep, I grabbed my notebook, the one I'd started when everything fell apart, and wrote, "She broke my heart, but I won't let her break me." It wasn't profound, but it was honest, and maybe that was the first step toward healing. Weeks passed. Time didn't heal anything, not really, but it dulled the edges. The raw sting of betrayal morphed into something else, an ache that lived somewhere beneath my ribs, present but less suffocating. I was functioning, which felt like progress. Work, gym, sleep, repeat. On the surface, everything looked fine, but beneath that thin layer of normalcy, there was a war. I'd tell myself I was okay. Then I'd wake up at 3 a.m., my chest tight, replaying moments I didn't want to remember. Like the time Emily surprised me with tickets to that concert because she just wanted to see me smile, or how she'd laugh at my terrible cooking attempts and say, "You're lucky you're cute." And now, every memory felt contaminated, like they belonged to someone else's life. Ethan, bless him, tried to pull me out of the spiral. One night, he showed up uninvited, again, pizza in one hand, a six-pack in the other. "You need to get out," he declared, plopping down on my couch like he owned the place. "I'm fine," I muttered, not even convincing myself. "Dude, you're not fine. You're basically a houseplant with Wi-Fi. You need to move, breathe, do something." I wanted to argue, but he was right. So I let him drag me to a bar downtown, a place buzzing with life, laughter, and bad music. It felt foreign. I stood there nursing a beer, watching people laugh like they'd never had their heart stomped on. That's when I saw her, Rachel. She wasn't flashy. Just sitting at the bar, flipping through her phone, her hair tied up messily, a faint smile playing on her lips like she'd just thought of something funny. She didn't notice me at first, and I almost didn't approach. But something about her, maybe the ease with which she existed in that space, made me want to say something that I found myself walking over before my brain caught up. Is the beer here always this terrible, or is it just tonight? I blurted out, instantly regretting how awkward it sounded. She looked up, her smile widening. Depends. Are you always this critical, or is it just tonight? I laughed, the sound unfamiliar in my own ears. But it felt good that we talked. Nothing deep. Just easy. I didn't mention Emily. I didn't mention Richard. For the first time in months, I wasn't the guy whose wife cheated. I was just a guy, having a conversation with a stranger who didn't see the baggage I carried. After a while, Ethan appeared, clearly proud of himself for dragging me out. Rachel eventually left, but not before scribbling her number on a napkin and sliding it over with a wink. Call me if you ever need a better beer recommendation, she said. That I stared at the napkin after she left, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. But here's the thing about healing, it's not linear. Later that night, lying in bed, the darkness pressed down harder than usual. I found myself scrolling through old photos again, ones I'd thought I'd deleted. A picture of Emily and me at the beach, her head resting on my shoulder, both of us laughing. That I felt the weight of everything crash down. Anger. Regret. Lost. That I grabbed my notebook, flipping to a fresh page, and wrote, I hate that I still miss her. I hate that she doesn't deserve it. But mostly, I hate that I'm not over it. I closed the notebook, staring at the ceiling. But then I looked at the napkin on my nightstand, and for the first time, instead of drowning in the past, I thought about the possibility of something, maybe not love, maybe not even happiness, but something beyond the wreckage. That I wasn't there yet, but I was getting closer. The napkin with Rachel's number sat on my nightstand for days, untouched. It wasn't that I didn't want to call, it was that I didn't know why I wanted to. Was it because I was genuinely interested, or was it just a distraction from the chaos Emily left behind? Eventually, curiosity won. I stared at the number for a long time before finally texting me, hey, it's the beer critic from the other night. Got any recommendations? I hit send, my heart weirdly racing like I was back in high school. Within minutes, she replied, Rachel, the harsh critic lives. Depends, are you ready for something better, or should I start with light beer? I chuckled, a real laugh, not the forced ones I'd been faking. We exchanged a few more texts, light banter that felt effortless. There was no heavy undertone, no complicated history looming over our words. It was just easy. That we met for drinks a few nights later. Not at a noisy bar, but a small brewery she claimed had the best craft beer in the city. She wasn't wrong. But honestly, I barely noticed the beer. Rachel was refreshing in every sense, witty, sharp, with this natural confidence that wasn't about trying to impress. She talked about her love for photography, her travels, her dog named Moose who apparently hated squirrels with a passion. We laughed. A lot. That I didn't bring up Emily. Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't need to. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't defined by my past. I was just me. As we left the brewery, she smiled and said, you're not as grumpy as you look, you know. I laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. She hesitated for a second, then leaned in and kissed me, quick, soft, but enough to send a jolt through me. As I drove home, I felt something unfamiliar, hope mixed with fear. Because healing isn't just about getting over someone, it's about allowing yourself to feel again without the weight of the past holding you back. But the past isn't easy to outrun. That night, lying in bed, I felt it creeping back, the memories, the what-ifs, the anger. I thought about Emily, about Richard, about everything that had unraveled so quickly. That I reached for my notebook and wrote, moving on isn't about forgetting. It's about learning to live with the scars. And for the first time, that felt true. The kiss with Rachel lingered in my mind longer than I expected. It wasn't the kind of kiss that sent sparks flying or made me believe in fate or any of that nonsense. No, it was simpler than that. It was a reminder, a flicker of warmth after months of emotional coldness. But warmth can be deceptive, especially when you're still carrying frostbite under your skin. For the next few days, I floated between two worlds. On one side, there was Rachel, her effortless laugh, the way she crinkled her nose when she found something genuinely funny, the ease of our conversations. On the other side, there was the ghost of my past, the one that wore Emily's face, haunting the corners of my mind at night when everything went quiet. One morning, I was scrolling through emails, half distracted, when one popped up from Emily. Subject: "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. It had been weeks since I'd left, weeks since I'd heard her voice. I'd ignored every message, every call. But this one felt different, not because the words were any more significant, but because I wasn't the same person reading them. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I closed my laptop and went for a run, trying to outrun the storm brewing in my head. But you can't outrun memories, no matter how fast you go. Later that evening, after staring at the message for what felt like hours, I replied with a simple, okay. Tomorrow. We agreed to meet at a small cafe, one we used to frequent when things were good, before the lies, before the betrayal. As I walked in, the familiarity of the place hit me like a punch. The same worn-out chairs, the same chipped mugs, the same faint smell of roasted coffee beans. But everything felt different. I felt different. Emily was already there, sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug. She looked smaller. Not physically, but in the way someone does when they've lost something they can't get back. When she saw me, she forced a smile. "Hey." I nodded, sitting across from her, my heart strangely steady. There was an awkward silence before she finally spoke. "I've been thinking about what to say for weeks," she began, her voice softer than I remembered. "But nothing feels right." I didn't respond. I wanted her to keep going. I wanted to hear it. She took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry, Michael. I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to tell you that I regret it. All of it." I studied her face, searching for something: guilt, sadness, maybe even the woman I used to love. But all I saw was a stranger trying to stitch together words. "Too late, why now?" I asked quietly. She looked down at her coffee. "Because I miss you. Because I made a mistake, and I didn't realize what I had until it was gone." I leaned back, letting her words sink in. "Mistake?" I repeated, shaking my head slightly. "Cheating once is a mistake. A 6-month affair? That's a choice. Over and over again." She flinched, but I didn't stop. "You didn't just break my heart, Emily. You broke the version of me that believed in us. And that's not something an apology can fix." Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just clarity. "I thought about what I'd say if I ever saw you again," I continued. "I thought I'd yell, demand answers, maybe even try to understand. But standing here now, I realize I don't need any of that." She wiped her tears, her voice trembling. "So that's it? You're just done?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah. I am." I stood up, leaving her there, surrounded by the echoes of a life we'd lost. That night, I didn't feel broken. I felt freed. I opened my notebook one last time and wrote, "Closure isn't about the other person. It's about finally choosing yourself." And with that, I closed the chapter for good. Leaving the cafe felt like walking out of a chapter I'd been trapped in for far too long. There was no dramatic realization, no life-altering epiphany, just a quiet sense of finality, like placing a period at the end of a sentence. The weight I'd been carrying for months didn't disappear instantly, but it shifted, becoming something I could finally manage. The days that followed were different. Lighter. I woke up without that familiar ache in my chest, without checking my phone out of habit to see if Emily had reached out again. I didn't care anymore. And that was the most freeing part. I didn't care. Rachel texted me a few days later, Rachel, so, are you still the harshest beer critic in town, or have you softened up? I smiled at my phone, the simplicity of her message pulling me out of my own head. Me, I've evolved. Now I just criticize everything equally. She replied with a laughing emoji and an invitation to meet up again. We met at a park this time. No loud bars, no distractions, just us, a couple of coffees, and the sound of the city humming quietly in the background. Rachel had this effortless way of making things feel easy. No pressure, no expectations. Just conversation, laughter, and moments that didn't require me to be anything other than myself. You seem different, she said after a while, sipping her coffee. Different how? I asked, genuinely curious. She shrugged. Lighter. Like you're not carrying the same weight anymore. I thought about that. She wasn't wrong. I guess I finally realized I was holding on to something that wasn't mine to carry, I said quietly. She nodded, understanding without prying. As we walked through the park, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Not the kind you fake for others, but the real, quiet kind that settles in when you've finally made peace with the past. Eventually, Rachel stopped and looked at me. You know, you don't talk much about everything. And that's okay. But if you ever want to, I'm here. I appreciated that more than I could say. She wasn't trying to fix me. She was just offering space if I needed it. Later that night, sitting alone in my apartment, I opened my notebook again. It was almost full now, pages packed with anger, heartbreak, confusion, but also growth. I turned to a fresh page and wrote, healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without the pain. And as I closed the notebook, I realized I didn't need to fill it anymore, because I wasn't broken. I was whole, and this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. After that night, something shifted, not like flipping a switch, but more like a slow sunrise, where the darkness doesn't disappear all at once. It just fades. I realized I wasn't constantly checking my phone anymore, wasn't waking up with that heavy knot of dread in my chest. The past was still there, but it wasn't holding me hostage. Rachel and I kept seeing each other, not every day, not with any labels, just naturally. We'd meet for coffee, go on spontaneous walks, or sit on park benches, people watching, making up ridiculous backstories for strangers passing by. There was no pressure to be anything other than ourselves, no weight of expectation. That's what made it easy. One evening, we were sitting on the hood of her car, parked by the lake, watching the sunset. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, the water reflecting it like a mirror. The wind was cool, carrying that faint scent of summer fading into fall. She looked over at me and asked, "Do you ever think about her?" I didn't answer right away because I wanted to be honest, with her and with myself. "Yeah," I finally said. "But not the way I used to. It's like remembering an old scar, you know it's there, but it doesn't hurt anymore." She nodded, understanding without needing more explanation. That's what I liked about Rachel. She never pressed, never tried to fix me. She just let me be. After a moment of silence, she said, "You've come a long way, you know." I smiled softly. "Yeah. I guess I have." Later that night, back in my apartment, I found myself reaching for that old notebook. I hadn't written in it since the last time. I thought I was done with it, but something felt unfinished, like I needed to leave one final mark. I flipped through the pages, skimming past all the anger, heartbreak, and confusion I'd poured into it. It was like reading the story of someone else's life, a version of me I'd outgrown. On the very last page, I wrote, "Sometimes the people who break you are the ones who accidentally show you who you really are." I stared at the words for a while, letting them sink in. Then I closed the notebook, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Not for what happened, but for what I'd learned from it, because the truth is, life isn't about the chapters where you fall apart. It's about the ones where you put yourself back together. And for the first time, I was excited to see what the next page would hold. Time has a funny way of sneaking up on you when you're healing. One minute, you're drowning in the wreckage, and the next, you're standing on the shore, realizing you survived. It wasn't one big moment that did it. No grand gestures, no dramatic revelations. Just a series of small, quiet victories, days when I didn't think about Emily at all, nights when sleep came easily, mornings when I felt light. But closure isn't always about healing alone. Sometimes, it's about facing the ghosts one last time. It happened unexpectedly. I was at the grocery store of all places, picking up the essentials, coffee, bread, and way too many snacks. I turned the corner of the cereal aisle, and there she was, Emily. She froze when she saw me, her expression a mix of surprise and something else, regret, maybe. She looked different. Or maybe I did. Maybe time had been kinder to me. Michael, she said softly, like my name still held weight. That I gave a polite nod. Emily. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by cereal boxes and awkward silence. You look good, she offered, as if that was supposed to mean something. Thanks, I replied. I wasn't being cold, just honest. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I just felt nothing. She cleared her throat. I've been meaning to reach out, but I stopped her with a small shake of my head. It's okay. You don't need to. She looked down, fidgeting with the strap of her bag. I'm sorry. For everything. I gave her a small, genuine smile. I know. And that was it. No dramatic confrontation. No rehashing the past. Just two people who shared a story that had already ended. When I got home, I didn't feel shaken. I didn't feel anything, really. And that's when I knew, I was finally freed. I found the old notebook again, tucked away in the drawer. I flipped through the pages, remembering the weight of every word, every emotion that once felt unbearable. On the very last page, I wrote, I survived her. I found myself. And that's the real story. I closed the notebook one final time, not out of habit, but with peace, because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a life I'd built on my own terms. And I was finally home. Months passed, and life unfolded quietly, without the dramatic highs and lows that had once defined my days. But there was beauty in that simplicity, waking up to sunlight spilling through the blinds, brewing coffee without the heaviness of memories, walking through familiar streets that no longer whispered the past. Rachel and I grew closer, not because I needed her to fill a void, but because she didn't try to. She didn't complete me, she met me where I was, a whole person who had been broken and rebuilt, piece by piece. One crisp fall morning, we went for a hike just outside the city. The trees were a riot of colors, red, orange, gold, their leaves crunching beneath our boots. We didn't talk much, just walked side by side, breathing in the cool air, letting the silence say what words couldn't. At the peak of the trail, we sat on a large rock overlooking the valley. The view was breathtaking, but it was the stillness that struck me, the kind of quiet that didn't demand anything from me. Rachel turned to me, her eyes reflecting the warm hues of the setting sun. You've changed since we met, she said softly. I nodded, not needing to explain. She saw it in me, the difference between surviving and living. After a moment, I pulled out the old notebook, the one I thought I'd closed for good. I'd brought it with me, not out of habit, but because I'd felt a pull to write one last thing. I flipped to the very back, to the final blank page, and wrote, this isn't the end of my story. It's just the part where I stopped looking back. I closed the notebook gently, not with the weight of loss, but with the lightness of acceptance. Rachel leaned over, resting her head on my shoulder, and we watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. In that moment, I realized something simple, something true. Sometimes the most beautiful parts of our story come after the pages we thought would break us. And this was my new beginning.